Hey there, bibliophiles and those raising bibliophiles. Are you looking to find books worthy of your children to read and which ones you may want to avoid? Well, join me for this week's book review while I will let you know if it should be added to your to-read list or your bad book list. Today's book review is a new author that I have encountered. Her name is Polly Horvath, and the book is Library Girl. And I'm going to be honest, I picked this title up because I saw the description and I saw the book cover and the title, and what lover of books doesn't love a library or a story about a girl who's grown up in a library? Sounds awesome. But I'm going to be honest, I was a little disappointed. The story did not sort of live up to my hopes and my dreams, and I'm going to tell you why. So I was really just disappointed overall. Like, it's a fine story, I guess, to a degree, but I don't think it's going to appeal to most readers. I think there's a very slim readership for this book who would actually enjoy it, and it may be difficult for some of them to get started just due to the writing style. The premise of this particular story is Essie, and she's an 11-year-old girl who's been raised in the local library where she is believed to have been abandoned by her mother. And there are 4 librarians, 3 of which who work in the children's section and 1 who works in the reference section. And they have basically chosen to raise Essie. And their idea of the purpose of doing this is they are fearful that if they were to leave with her, it would be seen as kidnapping. But if they raise her in the library, then they've only taken care of what was left there. So I guess a good idea to some degree, but that's basically the premise of the story. And so I'm just going to read you a little bit from the opening chapter of this book. So not right from the beginning, but a little bit. The particular morning this story begins, the one that the 4 librarians would never forget. Lucinda happened to be in the office of the children's department because she had brought a big box of homemade donuts for the children's library. She was trying to up her game baking-wise, and often brought the children's librarians baked goods. She had tried to bring them to the librarians in the adult department, but they were all on weird diets, macrobiotic, keto, and DASH and such, as grown-ups often are. The children's librarians, on the other hand, recognized a good cupcake when they saw one, and didn't let it go to waste. In this way did Lucinda become friends with Doris, Taisha, and Jean Marie, even though usually they excluded anyone who didn't reread Elizabeth Enright at least once a year. The librarians had put on a pot of coffee and were having a cup each while savoring jelly, chocolate dip, and salted caramel donuts. So that gives you a little taste of the writing style for this particular book. Essie in this story, so at the beginning, they're kind of giving that context, that background about finally living up to the point that the story really begins to take place, because Essie is now 11. So the beginning is sort of setting some of that up, the influence of these 4 women who become her 4 mothers, essentially taking care of her in the library. Essie is starting to get to explore and have a little more freedom in the story, and that's really a lot of this takes place. I do want to share, there's one particular aspect or page of this story on page 26 that I was not a fan of. And I'm going to read it to you, and then I'll jump back into the rest of the story, but just in a sense of trying to stay chronological, I guess, in the story as they're setting up for the mothers. So kind of how I was reading that little bit, setting up the women. They're going to go on to find her in the library. They decide to keep her and raise her in the library and keep her secret. And so it goes into how they do all that. But now Essie's 11, and so we're seeing a little bit more from her perspective. She was extravagantly loved by 4 mothers. She had miles of books to read and was read to at an early age. She had many books to explore daily, and she had 4 sensible mothers who didn't ascribe to the nonsensical notion that there were any special books for any special people by race, creed, religion, or age, but instead believed that anyone could and should read everything, that all stories were good stories, so long as they were true to the teller, and that you should never try to pretend that the things that had happened in the past hadn't, or that the way people believed or thought or felt hadn't happened. Because what good was a story if it was censored and untrue? Stories were for sharing the infinite ways there were to be human. It wasn't up to one group to decide how another should have felt or acted. It was important only to understand they did and try to understand that. And therefore, enlarge your own scope of understanding. Only the storyteller can relate his or her own truth, and everyone else should keep their sticky little fingers off of it. All four of Essie's mothers were sensible enough to know that the only way books let you into the hearts of people is by letting you into their imperfect human hearts as they actually are, not as you, the reader, might wish them to be. So one of the things I didn't really like about this is this idea of setting up that if you oppose to any of these ideas that the author is really, the narrator is setting in here, is that you're unsensible, that it's not sensible to be this way. So that was a little bit of a concern. Also this idea that all stories should be read. And I'm going to be honest, this book is going to go on my bad book list, not because of this. Okay, so definitely something to caution and let parents know if you choose to read this story, if all of that. But really, I just didn't find the story that engaging. I can't think of any, maybe one or two middle school readers that I know of that would even pick this book up, that would make it through the story and have enjoyed it. That's the reason I kind of would put this on a bad book list. Life's too short to read bad books, so why waste? I mean, I spent some time on this one just to make you aware and to share what I've been reading, but I don't think that this would be appealing to most middle grade readers. And definitely, as you're reading in this, like, the author has a point of view that she's trying to share, and that's all good and fine. She has every right to do that and to share that in here. But I think as parents, we do have the right. And we do have the responsibility to say that there are certain ideas in certain books that we don't want our children reading. The other reason not a huge fan of this story is there's a character, G.E., and then there's also a character, Matterhorn, who are just nefarious people. I mean, G.E. is, you know, a child, so you can take that to a degree. But Matterhorn is this librarian who is brought into the library. So there's Mr. Fellows, who's like the director, and she comes in and she's like the co-director, that the library wants to kind of get things under handle and they don't feel like he's doing a very good job. And she comes in and she clearly like hates children. And I just didn't understand, like, if you are wanting to promote libraries and you're wanting to promote good literature, why would you present a character who is really against a lot of that stuff, who doesn't like children in the library, who doesn't like children, like everything needs to be quiet, all these sorts of things? I don't know. It just didn't sit well with me. G.E., you find out in the story, so she is starting to explore a little bit more. She's given some freedom. There's a local shopping center that she can go to, and so she goes to this place. And she meets this young boy named G.E. And so they develop a relationship, a friendship. And she comes to this conclusion that they must be twins and that they were abandoned both and separated at birth. They've been growing up in these parallel lives. He's been growing up in the department store Gilmore. She's been growing up in the library. And so there's four, dads raising him, and she's had these four mothers, and so they concoct this scheme that they're going to get them all to basically be matchmakers, which happens, right? That does happen in the story, and Essie's all excited, right? Like, this is like a dream come true. This is like a book story that she has read, and so they come together to kind of reveal the secret because the moms haven't revealed Essie, and so Essie just blurts everything out. And the men are shocked. And what you come to find out is that G.E. has been playing with her this whole time. He has not been abandoned. He has not been raised in the Gilmore's department store. And Essie is crushed, just absolutely crushed by the meanness and the horribleness. And so one of these men end up calling the police, saying that these women have basically kidnapped and harbored this child. Matterhorn gets all up into it, and she's, excited because she can attack the librarians and Essie all at once. And what you ultimately come to find out is that Mr. Fellows in the story has been Essie's father the entire time. Like, that's her dad. He accidentally left her in the children's section one day because he had twins. So GE and her are actually twins. So that part of the story was correct for Essie. But GE's been raised by the dad the whole time, and she's been raised in the library. The story eventually ends with them all ending up in the same building together. Everyone's got different apartments and whatnot. If you're listening to this and you're like, what is this story? Like, I really feel like that. I just don't know what in this story was engaging or would have been great for these, young readers to read or get from the story. I don't know. Just not my thing. I definitely wasn't a huge fan. And then Essie at the end is like just beyond angry. She has been so hurt. And so here's a little section of the book from her. It says, Essie nodded, but was not cheered. She found she liked particularly no one anymore. And the more people she disliked, the more she found to dislike about them. The more still she found to dislike. She had the odd sense that her dislike was spiraling out of control. It was disconcerting, but she was sure she was right about all of them. She could see what was wrong or lacking with almost everyone she met now. No one would fool her again. She was no longer giving anyone a chance to hurt her so deeply. She had ventured into the wide world, and that was what it had taught her. So she's super angry, and there's points in the story later where they're having dinner at the marriages and all that stuff where she's sort of wrestling and kind of makes a turn with some of this, but Oscar is hands down the best character in the whole book. He's the only one who's kind of in the background with any sense and his kindness, and he gives a few wise words to Essie here. But she's, I don't know. I don't know. It's never, to me, like fully resolved. There's a little bit at the end of the book where it's like in the future of things. And so she does go into like Essie grew up, and when she became children, she was able to have forgiveness for her father because she understood what it was like to have colicky children, and that, he accidentally left her and he just, never manned up and took care of his child. I don't know. It's all very strange. Then he remarries, and GE is whatever, GE is. And page 237, Essie finally looked right at GE. She had refused to ask GE why he had played such a mean joke because she didn't want to break the dignity of her silence. But she asked herself, and she learned nothing from her mother's. If people were like the books in the library, if everyone was their own story, then what had her mothers taught her? That all stories were good stories as long as they were true to the teller, and that you should never try to pretend that the things that had happened in the past hadn't, or that the way people believed or thought or felt hadn't happened. Because what good was a story if it was censored and untrue? Stories were for sharing the infinite ways there were to be human, and apparently this was GE's way. I guess it's just his way to show that he's human. I'm not really sure. This book may be a little bit much for me to sit and digest and think through. Again, I would put this on like a not to read list. I just don't think it would appeal to many readers. Some of the writing style, which I like, I just don't know that it would necessarily appeal to some of those readers. And while this is my first encounter with a Polly Horvath novel, I did look her up a little bit, and she's quite an accomplished writer. So I definitely plan to read something else of hers just to kind of give that a fair shake and see what it is, that maybe I just picked up a book that was just not her best. Certainly not one of my favorites, and definitely take that for what it's worth. Hopefully that information is helpful to you, and feel free to join me next week for another book review.